Addiction, it's a neurological disorder. Addiction is a neurologically based disease. For many years, recovery specialists have compared alcoholism or addictions to a physical disease, like diabetes. In reality, addictions are more closely related to a neurological disorder, like Tourette's syndrome, than they are to diabetes. If the problems you suffer stem from severe alcoholism or addiction, you must accept that these problems are not primarily mental or free will issues. For most, addictions are not about willpower. The problems facing addicts, alcoholics, and their families are miserable, disgusting, and infuriating. They are often hopelessly discouraging. But to imagine that an addict could change if he wanted to is a serious misunderstanding of the long-term dynamic of addictive disorder. The fact is precisely that an addict cannot change in the long run, even if he wants to. That is the definition of addiction, the loss of control over the use of a substance. It is important to understand that this loss of control is manifested, not in terms of days or weeks, but in longer-term behaviors, terms of months and years. The reason addicts have lost control is because they have suffered permanent, physical, neurological changes based in their brains and nervous systems. The disorder manifests in long-term obsessive-compulsive behaviors outside the realm of the addict's own control. It is true enough that the use of chemicals begins with chosen behavior, but if alcoholism or addiction develops, the problem has moved outside the realm of free choice. It has developed into a long-term mental and physical neurological disorder. All the emotional feelings involved in drug or alcohol seeking is based in neurology. Addiction is based in physical dependency, created by altered neurotransmitter balances, and driven by millions upon millions of new living, functioning, active neurological pathways which have been established to sustain the condition in the addict's brain. The new neurological pathways are permanently established, and they will not just disappear. The primary neurological disorder is only complicated by physical dependence on the substances. The physical dependence on the substances is secondary. Physical drug withdrawal does not change the underlying neurological addictive disorder. After drug withdrawal, long-term overpowering cravings are predictable. These cravings are, in reality, spontaneous nerve impulses. Even in the longer term, overwhelming cravings are outside the addict's control. Example of a nerve pathway. It is difficult for people to grasp the meaning of a nerve pathway or why this is related to addiction. Often when people hear a new idea like an addictive impulse is the result of a nerve impulse, they are left unsympathetic. Addicts and non-addicts alike have a hard time believing that drug or alcohol use is anything more than a choice that is made in response to a habit. Deep down inside, most people believe that at its root, the behavior is always a choice. They are very, very wrong. This author was stuck in addiction for over a decade, so completely was he convinced that the mind was an immaterial spiritual power and that to call alcoholism or addiction a disease was a cop-out for the weak-willed. This author believed that, each and every time, free choice was at the root of addictive behavior, until one day, in another recovery facility, the author stumbled upon the concept of neuropathways by reading a book called The Training of the Will by Jesuit priest. That book was written in the early 1900s. Even then, the Jesuits knew that the root of almost all behavior was based, not in free will, but in neurological wiring. For the Jesuits, training the will essentially consists in training the body. After reading that book, this author began to understand that while his mind, his intellect, was indeed an immaterial power, the overwhelming cravings for drugs or alcohol were based in his body. He came to believe that addiction really was a neurological disease. Consider the following. Most people cannot wiggle their ears. The wiggling of the ears is really nothing but flexing the muscles of the scalp above the ears. The reason most people cannot wiggle their ears is because they are not familiar with the neurological pathway which controls the muscle of the scalp above their ears. However, without exception, every person in the world can be trained to wiggle their ears. Simply by applying electrodes to the muscles of the scalp above the ears, causes the muscles to flex or spasm. Once the person feels where these muscles are, he finds that in fact he can wiggle his ears. The only reason he could not wiggle his ears before was because he had not established the neurological pathway which enabled him to do so. Like turning on a switch, a neurological pathway can be established simply by passing a charge of electrical current into the nerves of the body. Once a person has learned to wiggle his ears, he might actually do it spontaneously and unintentionally, just because the words are mentioned. This example is intended to illustrate how a simple neurological pathway is established. Before the electrode, there was no neurological pathway. After the electrode, the pathway has been established. The addictive neurological response to drugs and alcohol on the brain is infinitely more complex than this, but the physical basis is the same. The overwhelming craving for drugs or alcohol that endlessly defeats addicts is in reality a neurological impulse, and they have absolutely no control over the craving when it is triggered. All they know is that they want, they need, and they feel they must of the drug. This desire, this craving, is not a free choice. This desire is an electrochemical neurological brain impulse. A person who suffers from these cravings, to the detriment of his own life and the lives of others, is suffering from a physical, neurological disease termed addictive disorder. Recovery from addiction, withdrawing from physical dependence on the drug, does not change the fundamental addictive disorder. The whole neurological, chemical and emotional being of an addict or an alcoholic has become permanently disordered. An addict or an alcoholic has developed a very, very severe disease. He must take the matter very, very seriously. A quick 7-day detox will never be an answer. I took 4 months to detox before I began to feel somewhat normal again. The alcoholic addict in the longer term is like a rat that has become habituated by a scientist to choosing cocaine over food. The rat in the short term cannot control the neurological impulse to choose the cocaine. The rat will continue to seek it, ignoring food and water until he dies. The rat's nerve impulse to use the cocaine has nothing to do with free will. The addict alcoholic suffers from an identical disorder in the long term. The addict cannot control these spontaneous, overwhelming neurological impulses to use, any more than the rat can on the short term. The neurological impulse is called a craving. Just by examining an addicted rat, you can't see the obvious problem. But the new neurological pathways that have now been established are permanent and life-threatening. These are just as physical and real as any disease. Addiction is a self-contracted neurological disease. It is a created disorder. Nonetheless, it is also a physical problem on a neurological level, and it is very real. A chemically dependent person cannot stop the overpowering cravings for the substance in the long term, any more than someone with Parkinson's disease can stop tremors. Self-knowledge avails us nothing. The addiction will never somehow go away without intervention of some kind. An addict will not ever recover if he can't just kick for a few days. The whole emotional, physical and neurological system has already been altered too drastically for any temporary kick to even scratch the surface of the underlying disorder. At the very minimum, an introductory 30-day dry-out period must somehow be enforced. Minimizing, hoping or rationalizing that the problem might somehow be overcome by more modest measures, are wishful thinking. Addictive impulses are generated physiologically. They often lie dormant for many days or weeks as the addict attempts to recuperate from the painful, physical, or emotional trauma the addictions themselves have inflicted. But the underlying neurological conditions remain very much intact. Neurologically based impulses to use or drink require at least 4 weeks of enforced abstinence, just to begin to dissipate enough to be manageable. Then another 6, extremely critical weeks are required to adjust to living without the chemical. Depression, anger, boredom, and then happy excited feelings are predictable. These feelings always follow initial detox. All of these feelings will eventually trigger an uncontrollable addictive impulse in early sobriety. There is no way to turn off these inevitable overpowering addictive impulses. During this period, the addict needs help. With the help they need, the chemically dependent person can improve dramatically if he can work through the initial weeks of mandatory depression, cope with recurring anger, and maintain at least 10 weeks of abstinence. 70 days seems like an eternity in early recovery, but shorter periods of abstinence do nothing to subdue the underlying neurological conditions. With this in mind, it is essential that an addict prepare himself for almost 3 months of initial recuperation. It's precisely when the addict feels that his system is stabilizing that he is in the gravest danger. This usually occurs at about 45 days clean. It is then when the addict must begin to resolve underlying emotional and social conflicts. For an addict, stress causes craving. To become free of addiction, an addict must resolve the conflicts in his life. He can do this by accepting responsibility for his actions and by facing and resolving his deepest anxieties. He must make amends to himself, to his family, and to society. The only way for an addict to relieve the stresses which cause him to use is to identify the interior and exterior conflicts in his life and resolve them. You have to name it, to claim it. When conflicts are resolved, serenity becomes possible. By achieving new levels of interior serenity, compulsive behaviors can be overcome. It is serenity which enables an addict to be relieved of compulsions. Serenity can only be achieved by the resolution of conflict. Over time, and the resolution of conflicts, addiction becomes manageable. Most addicts are not consciously aware of many of the conflicts from which they actually suffer. For permanent relief, an outside support system is the most helpful. According to Alcoholics Anonymous, the alcoholic addict must come to accept that the underlying condition of the disease consists precisely, and always being defenseless against taking that first hit or first one. No matter how much clean time one accrues, he forever remains defenseless against using again. According to the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, at some point, at some time, for perhaps no reason, the alcoholic addict will always use again. That is exactly what true alcoholism addiction is. The addict alcoholic remains forever defenseless against using again that first time. His only defense against the so-called first one must come from a power greater other than himself. The complete healing process comes from an internal dependency shift. 10 weeks of abstinence are required to subdue the strong neurological impulses to use. After a minimum 10-week neurological pacification or detox, can the recurring compulsion to use the chemical be permanently relieved. This is accomplished through a neurological rewiring. The alcoholic addict must stop imagining that they can somehow permanently stay clean by themselves. This doesn't mean that they need to attend meetings for the rest of their lives. Eternal meetings are not the point, but a radical dependency shift must be effected within the addict's own heart and mind. He must psychologically shift away from relying on the validity of his own thought process about his addiction. To effectively rewire his disordered nervous system, he must come to rely fiercely and absolutely upon the directions provided from an external support system. By mentally changing what he relies upon, his nervous system undergoes a profound change. Consider this example. 2 new people attend a support meeting. It's not the type of meeting or support group that is important. The first person thinks to himself, I don't want to be here. These people are unattractive. The thought of having to associate with them forever disgusts me. He is now depending upon the validity of his own internal thought process. He drives away and continues to try to stay clean on his own, and to continue to depend on the validity of his own thought process. Then he has sorrowful trouble in his relationships, which breaks his heart. He fails to succeed as he thinks he ought to, which breaks his heart. Something bad happens, or something good happens, it doesn't matter, and he thinks to himself, I can't deal with sobriety right now. This is the person depending upon the validity of his own thought process. His addictive impulse is triggered. In a matter of time, the strong cravings, neurological impulses, overwhelm him, and he begins to use again. Now, consider the second person who attends the support meeting. He also thinks to himself, I don't want to be here. These people are unattractive. The thought of having to associate with them forever disgusts me. But this person says out loud to the group, I don't want to be here. You people seem unattractive. The thought of having to associate with you disgusts me. And the whole group, with one voice, says to him in reply, that's how you are supposed to feel. That's okay. You should feel that way. You're new. This is new. We are unattractive. The thought of associating with us should disgust you. It's okay to feel that way. But from now on, you must become willing to take directions. You must become willing to listen to us. You cannot be in control of your own addiction anymore. You must let go absolutely and no longer depend upon your own devices, or you will never recover from your addiction. This person accepts what they say. He is willing to shift his internal dependency away from relying on himself for recovery. This begins to rewire his neurology. His nervous system learns new responses to old stimuli. Then, he too has trouble in his relationships, which breaks his heart. He fails to succeed as he thinks he ought to, and this breaks his heart. He also thinks to himself, I can't deal with sobriety right now, but he is under orders. His habits kick in, and he calls for support. The support system says with one voice, feeling bad is okay, but using is not okay. You can't do that. You will not do that. You would be better to drive up right now to the local mental institution and check yourself in, because what you are thinking about doing right now is sheer insanity. Because he has now shifted his dependency and he no longer relies upon the validity of his own thought process, he obeys. He takes directions. The rewiring of the dependency shift has taken hold, and he stays clean. He has established new neurological pathways and is able to stand fast through the critical moments. He has effected the necessary dependency shift. His formerly disordered neurological system has become rewired. When he is triggered, he automatically goes to the support system, even if it is the local mental hospital, but he stays clean. Through a total dependency shift, he is soon permanently relieved of the obsession to use the chemical, and he recovers. Effecting this necessary dependency shift is most easily done through submission to programs like Alcoholics Anonymous. Any unwillingness to completely accept the directives of a support program, just as it is presented, is just a continuation of the addictive disorder. Sadly, anyone who is special or who doesn't need to comply with a support program, just as it is presented, will permanently suffer the misery of addiction. There can be no permanent relief for anyone who cannot effect the requisite dependency shift. This only happens when they stop depending on themselves to manage their own sobriety and they become fiercely willing to take directions. They must rely on the external support system more than they used to rely on the external chemical. In some rare instances, there are a very select few that are trainable to return to normal living without the use of a program. However, these are far and few between. But it is advised that you also must accept the use of some professional counseling to work through your troubles and sorrows of your past, which the 12 steps also assist with. For many, the 12-step programs have been the best answer to addiction. In this author's opinion, it really is God who gets miserable alcoholics and addicts clean anyway. Though human beings have physical bodies and live in a material world, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Human beings may be a complex mass of neurological pathways, but we are people, not rats. We may be deeply frustrated, or disappointed or wounded. Though we may suffer terribly, we do have an infinite capacity to heal, to achieve, to love and be loved, to create and to contribute. No one deserves the misery of addiction. Parts of this video have been paraphrased. The parts that have been are referenced in Internet article Addiction as Disease by David R. Hughes, 1997. URL http://www.medical-online.com/addict.htm. Thank you all for watching or listening. Please like and subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future videos I create.